A millionaire hired a modest cleaner to take care of his mansion. One day, he came home earlier than expected and was taken aback by what he found her doing with his 7-year-old son. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, gently running her fingers over the crinkled bills in her hand. It wasn't a lot, just enough to cover Owen's school fees for the month, along with a few other essentials. She took a deep breath and glanced toward her bedroom door, where her son Owen was probably already asleep. Even though she worked long hours barely getting by, Grace felt a sense of pride. She was doing it for him, providing for him every single day. She left her small home before the sun even came up, catching a bus that took her to a part of town she never imagined she'd be a part of. Calvin Ellis's mansion sat in the heart of Brookhaven, a neighborhood that could have been ripped from the pages of a fairy tale. With its vast lawns, ornate fountains, and perfectly trimmed hedges stretching as far as the eye could see, it was nothing short of spectacular. Grace had been working as a cleaner in this luxurious home for almost 2 years, and each day still felt surreal. She was surrounded by gold-trimmed chandeliers, gleaming marble floors, and furniture that cost more than she could ever dream of. But none of it ever felt like hers. It was just the place she worked. As Grace moved through the endless hallways of the mansion, her mind stayed focused on her tasks. She wasn't there to admire the art or daydream about the breathtaking views from the windows. Her priority was always getting the job done quickly and no complaints, no fuss. That way, she could hold on to her position and keep paying for Owen's schooling and his future. The thought of him was what kept her grounded, reminding her why she was working so tirelessly. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Eli, Calvin's son, attended a modest school, one where he was one of the few children raised by a single parent. Grace always made sure Owen never felt different, always gave him the best she could, even if it meant going without herself. She wanted Owen to feel secure, to feel like he belonged even at just 7 years old. Already, he was becoming a thoughtful and sensitive boy, full of questions and curiosity about the world around him. He often asked about her work, especially about the grand house she cleaned. But Grace kept her answers short, never wanting to burden him with worries that weren't his to carry, especially at his age. Though she worked in the Ellis mansion, she didn't often interact with Calvin Ellis. He was a tall, composed man, exuding authority in every room he walked into. Known in the business world as a brilliant, cutthroat leader, to Grace, he was simply her employer, distant, aloof, and absorbed in his own world. On the rare occasions when they crossed paths in the hall, Calvin would give a slight nod of acknowledgement, but that was about it. Grace didn't mind. She wasn't there to be noticed. Her world was about her son, while Calvin seemed to revolve around his work. His son Eli was often left to his own devices, cared for by nannies or tutors. Grace had seen him wandering the mansion's halls, a lonely expression on his face. She didn't know much about Eli's life, but the other staff had told her that his mother had passed away a few years ago. Since then, Calvin had buried himself in his career, leaving Eli to grow up with nannies and no real parental connection. No wonder the boy seemed so isolated. Grace had occasionally caught glimpses of him playing by himself or sitting quietly, always looking a little lost. One afternoon, as she dusted the shelves in the family room, Grace found herself thinking about how different her life was from the one lived by those in this grand house. Here she was, constantly worrying about how she'd make it through the month, while the Ellis family never seemed to have a care in the world. But despite all the wealth and luxury, Grace couldn't help but feel that, in some strange way, she and Eli shared a kind of loneliness. A feeling of not quite fitting in, of being disconnected from everything around them. But Grace was resilient. Her life might not have been full of riches, but it had a deep sense of purpose. Every decision she made, every sacrifice she made was for Owen. And even if she never became wealthy, she was rich in her love for him. Her work in the mansion was just a means to an end, a way to secure a brighter future for him. As she wrapped up her day and gathered her things, Grace paused at one of the large windows overlooking the expansive garden. The setting sun bathed the manicured hedges and vibrant flowers in a warm golden light. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to wonder what life might have been like if things had turned out differently. But just as quickly, she pushed the thought aside. This was her reality, a life of hard work, but also a life filled with love. With her things in hand, she headed toward the door, her heart lifting at the thought of Owen's face lighting up as she walked in. That moment, when he ran to her with open arms, meant more to her than any mansion or fortune. That morning, as Calvin descended the staircase, he noticed Eli sitting alone at the breakfast table. The boy's head was lowered as he absent-mindedly pushed his cereal around with a spoon. Calvin paused at the bottom of the stairs, watching him for a moment. There was something almost haunting about the way Eli sat there, so small and solitary, surrounded by all the luxuries that money could buy, yet clearly lacking something far more important. "Good morning, Eli," Calvin said, stepping into the room with his usual reserved tone. Eli looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected his father to acknowledge him. "Good morning," he replied softly, his voice barely rising above a whisper. Calvin cleared his throat, feeling the awkward silence settle between them. "Are you ready for school?" he asked, grasping at any conversation to fill the void. Eli nodded, but there was no spark in his eyes, no excitement. He seemed almost ethereal, like he was merely going through the motions of his day. Calvin couldn't quite put his finger on it, but watching his son's detached expression stirred something in him. Guilt, perhaps. He wanted to say more, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. His phone buzzed in his pocket, cutting the moment short. Calvin pulled it out, glancing at the screen. His assistant was already reminding him of his packed agenda for the day. His mind snapped back to work, and the moment faded away. "I've got to go, Eli," he said briskly, giving his son a quick, absent-minded pat on the shoulder before leaving the room. As he stepped out, he didn't see Eli's gaze drop back to his untouched cereal, nor did he notice the faint disappointment clouding the boy's face once again. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at the mansion for her shift. She moved through her tasks methodically, cleaning room by room, dusting shelves and polishing surfaces until they gleamed. She had grown accustomed to the silence that filled the house, a stillness so thick it almost felt unnatural, even in such a grand place. As she worked her way toward the family room, Grace couldn't shake the sense of isolation that seemed to hang in the air, especially around Eli. There he was again, sitting alone on the sofa, clutching a small stuffed animal in his hands. When he noticed her enter, his eyes shifted, curious but cautious, like he wasn't sure whether to acknowledge her or retreat back into his own little world. Grace offered him a warm smile, sensing the sadness that lingered in his eyes. "Hey there, Eli," she said gently, her voice soft and inviting. Eli shifted slightly, glancing down at the stuffed animal. "Hi," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked, hoping to draw him out of his solitude. Eli shook his head slowly. "Not really," he said quietly. Grace felt a pang of empathy. She couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be so alone in a house full of people. Nannies, staff, and yet still so isolated. She wanted to say something comforting, something that might make him feel less lonely, but she knew her place. She was just the cleaner after all. Still, she couldn't help herself. "You know, when I was your age, I used to feel kind of lonely too," she shared, hoping he would feel understood. Eli's interest piqued. "You did?" he asked, looking up at her, his expression softening. Grace nodded. "I did. Sometimes it felt like no one really noticed me, but I'd always remind myself that I was special, even if no one else saw it. And you know what? That made me feel better. For the first time, I didn't feel so alone." She watched as a faint smile tugged at the corners of Eli's lips, his fingers tightening around the stuffed animal. "Thanks, Grace," he murmured, his voice quiet, almost as if he feared speaking too loudly. Just then Calvin walked into the room. His gaze flickered from Eli to Grace, his expression unreadable. Grace immediately straightened, sensing the shift in the air. She could feel the tension, Calvin's eyes narrowing slightly, almost as if he were questioning her interaction with his son. His face remained impassive, though his gaze lingered briefly on Eli's subtle smile, the first one he'd seen in a long time. For a moment, a flicker of curiosity crossed his mind. What had Grace said to make Eli look so happy? But Calvin quickly dismissed the thought. It wasn't important. With a brief nod to Grace, he turned and left the room, leaving them once again in the quiet. Grace couldn't shake the feeling of Calvin's gaze. His expression had been unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her and Eli, like he was watching them carefully, almost warily. She reminded herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd only said a few kind words to a lonely boy. Still, she couldn't ignore the underlying tension. She worked for people like Calvin, and she knew it was important to maintain a certain distance. She was careful to never cross that line. Days passed, one blending into the next as Grace continued her routine. She cleaned and tidied spaces that were always spotless to begin with, moving through the mansion's quiet corridors. She saw Eli now and then, usually alone, his expression thoughtful and distant. Occasionally, he would look her way and offer a shy smile, and Grace would return it warmly. It felt like a small, unexpected bond was forming between them. One she hadn't anticipated, but welcomed nonetheless. One afternoon, as she was polishing the silver in the dining room, Grace heard a burst of laughter echoing down the hall. She paused, almost disbelieving. The sound was bright, carefree, and so out of place in the otherwise silent mansion that it startled her. She set the silverware down and walked toward the sound, her curiosity piqued. She found Eli in one of the spare bedrooms, his little face alight with joy as he bounced around the room, holding one of the ornate decorative pillows like it was a treasure. Grace stood in the doorway, watching him with a smile. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him so animated, and something about his happiness filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected. "Grace!" Eli called out when he saw her, his eyes shining with excitement. "Look, I'm pretending this is a treasure, and I'm a pirate searching for it." Grace chuckled, stepping into the room. "A treasure, huh? Well, Captain Eli, it looks like you found the finest treasure in all the land." He grinned, clutching the pillow to his chest. "You can be my first mate," he said eagerly, his voice full of enthusiasm. "We have to guard the treasure from the enemy," he continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. Grace played along, pretending to look around the room for potential threats. "Aye, Captain. I'll keep watch. No one's taking our treasure while I'm here." The two of them spent the next few minutes wrapped up in their own imaginary world, laughing and whispering about invisible enemies, both caught in the carefree joy of the moment. It felt like the mansion's heavy silence had been lifted, replaced by the joy that Eli and Grace shared. Eli's laughter was infectious, filling the room with a liveliness that Grace had never experienced there before. But just as they were lost in their playful world, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the moment. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she recognized who it was. "Calvin." She quickly straightened up, smoothing her uniform and offering Eli a small, apologetic smile. Calvin appeared in the doorway, his expression stern, his gaze flicking from Eli to Grace. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with tension. Eli's smile faded immediately, and he looked down, clutching the pillow tighter against his chest. Grace cleared her throat, feeling like she had been caught doing something she shouldn't have. "We were just playing a little game, Mr. Ellis," she said, trying to sound casual. "I apologize if we disturbed you." Calvin's eyes narrowed ever so slightly as he studied her, his face unreadable. "I see," he said slowly, his tone heavy with unspoken judgment. He shifted his attention to Eli, who was now fidgeting nervously. "Eli," Calvin said, his voice softening just a little. "It's time to get ready for dinner. Go on now." Eli nodded and gave Grace one last shy smile before hurrying out of the room, leaving her alone with Calvin. Grace shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, unsure of how to break the silence. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the way Calvin was looking at her made her feel like she had crossed some invisible line. "I hope you understand," Calvin began, his voice cool. "I expect a certain level of professionalism here, Grace. I don't want you getting too involved." Grace met his gaze evenly, holding her ground. "I understand, Mr. Ellis," she replied quietly. "But Eli, he's a good kid. Sometimes a little kindness goes a long way." For a moment, Calvin seemed taken aback by her response. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then stopped, his expression hardening, a guarded look replacing the brief flicker of surprise. After a tense pause, he gave her a curt nod. "Very well," he said, his voice flat. "But I'd appreciate it if you could focus on your tasks. There's no need for distractions." Grace bit back the urge to respond, simply nodding in acknowledgement. She watched as Calvin turned and left, his posture stiff. His presence left the room colder than it had been just moments ago. Later that evening, as Grace prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her chest. She had only wanted to offer Eli a small moment of joy, a flicker of happiness in his otherwise lonely world. The look on his face as they played together, that was the look of a child finally feeling seen, feeling cared for. It had been a simple gesture, but it had meant so much to him. She couldn't understand why Calvin had been so opposed to it. On the bus ride home, Grace replayed the scene in her mind, wondering if she had crossed the line after all. She gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur as she thought of Owen, waiting for her at home. His face lighting up when she walked through the door was the only thing that truly mattered. But she couldn't help but think of Eli, and the expression he might have worn had his father seen him the way she did. Seen him for the boy he was, and not just as an extension of his business empire. With a quiet sigh, Grace closed her eyes, hoping that somehow her presence could offer Eli even a small comfort, even if she couldn't change the things that weighed on him. Little did she know, her impact on both the Ellis mansion and Calvin's heart was only just beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, Calvin couldn't shake the image of Grace and Eli laughing together from his thoughts. He told himself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of childish play that shouldn't concern him. But still it stirred something inside him, an uneasy feeling mixed with a strange curiosity. He found himself thinking about it more often than he expected, the sound of Eli's laughter lingering in his mind long after the moment had passed. As the days went by, Calvin began to observe Grace more closely, though he made sure to do so discreetly. Whenever he came home earlier than usual, he would catch glimpses of her working quietly, her presence unassuming yet oddly reassuring. There was something about her, a warmth, a kind of gentle calm, that seemed to affect everyone around her, even his son. One evening, as he was reviewing some financial reports in his study, Calvin's thoughts drifted back to Grace. He couldn't deny the positive effect she seemed to have on Eli. His son was smiling more, seemed more engaged, and even his teachers had mentioned improvements in his behavior. Yet a seed of doubt lingered in Calvin's mind. He had encountered too many people who feigned kindness and warmth for personal gain. In his world, where wealth often attracted opportunists, he had learned to be skeptical of others' motives. That thought unsettled him. What if Grace was only pretending? What if she was trying to worm her way into Eli's affections for some hidden agenda? The idea gnawed at him, twisting the way he viewed her. He convinced himself that he had to remain cautious, that it was prudent to keep a close eye on her. The next morning, Calvin decided to observe her more directly. He came down for breakfast at an unusual time, knowing Grace would be working nearby. He took a seat at the table, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet, though his attention was squarely on her. Grace moved through the dining room, polishing the table and straightening the chairs with quiet focus. She seemed completely absorbed in her work, carrying herself with a grace and humility that felt oddly out of place in such an opulent setting. Calvin couldn't spot anything overtly suspicious in her behavior, but his unease persisted. Just then Eli entered the room, his face lighting up when he saw Grace. "Good morning, Grace," he chirped, walking over to stand beside her. Grace paused, smiling down at him. "Good morning, Eli. How did you sleep?"
Eli shrugged.
"Okay, I guess. But I had a dream we were pirates again," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. Grace chuckled and crouched down to his level. "Really? Did we find any new treasure?"
Eli nodded eagerly.
"Yeah, but this time it was a whole room full of gold coins and jewels. You were there, and you helped me fight off the bad guys." Their exchange was simple, yet there was a warmth and familiarity in it that tugged at something inside Calvin. The sincerity in their interaction, something so genuine and free of pretense, stirred an emotion in him that he couldn't quite place. Calvin clenched his jaw, a strange mixture of jealousy and discomfort tightening his chest. It struck him how easily Eli seemed to open up to Grace, how naturally his son connected with her in ways he couldn't. The affection, the trust. It was something he had always struggled to cultivate with Eli. And now here was Grace, a stranger, weaving her way into his son's heart. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Determined to put an end to it, Calvin cleared his throat, his voice cool and measured. Eli, you should eat your breakfast. You don't want to be late for school. Eli looked up at him, his small face filled with a hint of disappointment. But the moment passed quickly, and the boy obediently moved toward the table, taking his seat. Grace, sensing the tension in Calvin's voice, resumed her work without a word. Her demeanor composed, professional as always. Later that evening, after Eli had gone to bed, Calvin found himself pacing in his study. The memory of that morning, the exchange between Grace and Eli, nagged at him. He wanted to believe that Grace's intentions were pure, that her kindness toward Eli was genuine. But the doubt, that familiar ache of suspicion, still lingered. In his world, people always had motives. There was always something they wanted, whether it was money, status, or something else. He couldn't help but wonder if Grace's warmth toward Eli was just another form of manipulation. Unable to ignore the discomfort any longer, Calvin made a decision. The next day he would confront her. He needed to know where she stood. He needed to understand her motives. He could no longer overlook the influence she was having on Eli, and if he was honest with himself, the way she was affecting him too. The following afternoon, Calvin found Grace in the family room, carefully arranging a vase of fresh flowers on the table. Her movements were fluid, graceful, the very picture of professionalism. But Calvin wasn't interested in her work. He cleared his throat, catching her attention. She looked up, surprised but quickly schooling her features into neutrality. "Mr. Ellis," she greeted politely, stepping back to give him space. "Grace," he began, his voice measured. "I wanted to speak with you about something important." He paused, his gaze fixed on her as he searched her face for any hint of deception. "I've noticed that you've been spending a lot of time with Eli." Grace's expression softened, her voice gentle. "He's a wonderful boy, Mr. Ellis. He just seems lonely sometimes. I think he enjoys having someone to talk to." Calvin's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Yes, I can see that. But I have to ask, what exactly are your intentions?" Grace blinked, taken aback by his sudden directness. "My intentions?" "Yes," Calvin said, his tone hardening. "It's not uncommon for people to develop attachments, especially when they're around wealth. I need to know if you're simply doing your job, or if there's something more." A flash of hurt crossed Grace's face, but she quickly masked it, her voice steady when she replied. "Mr. Ellis, I understand your concerns. But I assure you my only intention is to do my job and make sure Eli feels cared for. I'm not interested in your wealth or anything else. Eli deserves kindness, and I'm only trying to provide that." Calvin felt a twinge of guilt at her response, but his skepticism held firm. "I hope that's true," he said, his tone softer now but still guarded. "Because if I find out you're trying to use him, or me, you'll be dismissed immediately." Grace nodded, her face impassive, though Calvin could see the hurt in her eyes. "Understood, Mr. Ellis," she replied, her voice unwavering. "If you'd prefer, I can limit my interactions with Eli to strictly professional terms." For a moment Calvin felt the weight of his own words. He sensed that he had crossed a line, but his resolve remained. That would be best. As Grace resumed her work, Calvin turned and left the room, the hollow ache in his chest growing deeper. He had expected to feel relief after confronting her, but instead, he felt unsettled. Something about the way Grace had defended herself, the quiet strength in her words, stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, that in his desperate attempt to protect what he had, he was losing something far more important. Later that night, as Calvin lay in bed, sleep evading him, the image of Grace's hurt expression lingered. She had defended herself with dignity, but there had been a sadness in her eyes, something he hadn't expected. The realization gnawed at him, but he couldn't fully process it. His mind, still tangled in doubt, refused to let go of his suspicions. The following day, Grace moved through her tasks with a heaviness in her heart. Calvin's accusations from the day before echoed in her mind, stinging far more than she wanted to admit. She had worked so hard to stay focused and professional, but his words had hit a nerve. The implication that she could be manipulating his son for personal gain wounded her deeply. For Grace, her work had never been just about earning a paycheck. It was about maintaining her dignity, about proving to herself and to others that she was more than the circumstances that had shaped her life. She had worked hard to build a stable life for herself and Owen, and she refused to let anyone, especially Calvin, tear that down. Despite her resolve, Grace couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. She kept her distance from Eli now, doing her best to follow his instructions. Each time she saw Eli's hopeful face, ready for their usual conversations or games, she offered a polite smile but made sure to quickly move on to her next task. It pained her, but she didn't want to risk her job, not when Owen depended on her. She had sacrificed so much to get to this point, and she wasn't willing to lose it all because of a simple connection with a lonely boy. Eli noticed the change in her. The warmth that had once been there was gone, replaced by polite professionalism. Every time he tried to approach her, she would offer a quick smile but quickly return to her duties. It confused him, and a sense of sadness began to creep back into his chest. A loneliness he thought he had left behind when Grace had started spending time with him. One afternoon, as Grace was dusting the shelves in the family room, Eli approached her, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. His small figure stood hesitantly at her side, and when she glanced down, he looked up at her with those big, hopeful eyes that always seemed to hold a world of emotion. "Grace," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper as he tugged on her sleeve. Did I do something wrong?" The question took her by surprise, and Grace felt a lump form in her throat. She crouched down to meet his gaze, forcing a smile even as her heart ached. "Of course not, Eli. You didn't do anything wrong." He shifted, holding his stuffed animal tighter. "But you don't play with me anymore," he murmured, his voice faltering. "Did my dad say you can't?" Grace hesitated, not wanting to say too much but also not wanting to lie. She took a steadying breath and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups have to follow certain rules even if they don't want to," she said softly. "It doesn't mean I don't care about you, okay?" Eli nodded slowly, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice trailing off as he hugged his stuffed animal tighter to his chest. Grace straightened up and returned to her work, but the guilt in her chest felt unbearable. She had tried to do what was right, but she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. If, by following Calvin's rules, she had broken the fragile bond she had shared with Eli. Calvin's jaw clenched at the staff member's words, frustration and helplessness swirling inside him. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, around his life, thinking that control was the key to everything. But now those walls were proving to be nothing more than a barrier between him and the people he cared about, between him and his son. "I see," Calvin muttered, standing up abruptly. He barely registered the staff member's retreating footsteps as he walked toward the door. His mind raced, the same questions spiraling in his head. What had he done? He had pushed Grace away, driven her out of Eli's life, and now he was watching his son fall apart. Calvin's steps were brisk as he moved through the house, heading for Eli's room. The mansion seemed eerily quiet, almost suffocating in its silence. It felt different now, empty in a way he hadn't anticipated. When he reached Eli's door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. What could he say? What could he do? He wasn't good at this. He never had been. He wasn't a father who knew how to fix things with words or gestures, and now it seemed too late to learn. But Eli needed him. Calvin couldn't ignore that. So he opened the door. Eli was sitting at his desk, his shoulders hunched, staring blankly at his homework. His stuffed animal sat abandoned on the bed, a silent reminder of the joy he used to find in Grace's presence. When Eli saw his father, he didn't react immediately. His eyes were dull, lost in a world Calvin didn't understand. "Eli." Calvin's voice was quiet, unsure, as though he was testing the waters for a connection he wasn't sure existed anymore. Eli didn't look up, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a subtle recognition that his father was there. Calvin stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind him. He didn't know how to bridge the distance that had grown between them, but he had to try. I've been thinking," Calvin began, his throat tightening. "About Grace." At the mention of her name, Eli's eyes flickered. He didn't look at his father, but his hands clenched slightly, a sign of the emotion he was trying to keep under control. Calvin hesitated but pushed on. I didn't handle things well, Eli. I made a mistake. Calvin's voice softened. He wasn't used to apologizing. Hell, he was used to being the one who made the decisions, the one who held everything together. But this time it was different. Eli's silence was louder than any argument. I made you lose someone who cared about you, Calvin continued, his words coming out slower now, as if he was trying to untangle the mess inside him. I was wrong to push her away, and I'm sorry. Eli's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, and Calvin fought the urge to just walk away, to fix things with the old, familiar methods of control and distance. But this wasn't something he could fix with power or money. This was about Eli, about the connection they had, or rather didn't have anymore. I've been trying to fix things with the wrong tools, Calvin admitted, the weight of his own failings pressing down on him. I thought I was protecting you, Eli, but I see now that I was just scared. Eli finally looked up at him, his face hollow with confusion and pain. Why did she leave, Dad? His voice was small, barely audible, and it struck Calvin like a physical blow. Why indeed? She had her own life, Eli. Responsibilities, Calvin began, but he knew his answer wasn't enough. It wasn't the real reason. The real reason was his own fear. His own inability to trust anyone outside his carefully curated world. I didn't want her getting too close. I didn't want you to get hurt. But I liked her, Eli said quietly. His voice trembled slightly, and the pain in it broke something inside Calvin. She was nice to me. I know, Eli, Calvin replied, his voice thick with regret. I know. And I shouldn't have made her leave. Eli didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared down at his hands, the stuffed animal now clutched tightly in his grip. I miss her, he murmured. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Calvin stood there, helpless, feeling the gulf between them widening. He had made a decision that was meant to protect his son, but in doing so, he had pushed away the one person who made Eli smile, who made him feel seen, and who had brought light into their cold, lonely house. I'm sorry, Eli, Calvin said again, his voice breaking a little. I didn't mean for you to get hurt. Eli didn't respond, but Calvin could see the tear that formed in the corner of his son's eye. Calvin felt something inside him crack. This wasn't what I wanted, he thought. This isn't the life I wanted for him. Eli wiped the tear away quickly, but Calvin saw it, and it stung like a physical wound. His son had always been strong, always tried to hold it together. But Calvin could see now that the weight of his decisions had broken that quiet resolve. He had to fix this. I'll try to make it right, Eli, Calvin said, more to himself than to his son. I don't know how, but I'll try. Eli didn't answer, but there was a slight nod, a silent acceptance that maybe, just maybe, his father was trying. Calvin felt the smallest flicker of hope, but it was fragile, like a candle flame in the dark. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He couldn't keep living in fear. He couldn't keep hiding behind walls. And if he was going to fix this, it started with him, his own choices, his own mistakes. He had pushed Grace away, and it was time to find a way to bring her back. He had always relied on quick fixes to solve problems, whether it was saying the right thing or offering the right amount of money. But this time none of that seemed to help. He had pushed away the one person who had brought Eli Real comfort and joy, and now he was facing the consequences. Thank you, he said quietly, signaling her departure. Once she was gone, he sank into his chair, rubbing his temples, feeling the heavy burden of his decisions pressing down on him. The truth was he'd been scared. Scared that someone like Grace, someone from outside his world, might come in and disrupt the carefully controlled life he had built for himself and Eli. He hadn't wanted her influence, hadn't wanted to risk feeling vulnerable. But now, as he looked at Eli's sadness, the impact of his choices was impossible to ignore. He had tried to protect Eli from forming attachments, thinking it would shield him from disappointment. Instead, he had built a wall between himself and the one person who mattered most. That night, after tucking Eli into bed, Calvin stood in the doorway, watching his son curled up under the blankets. Eli looked even smaller than usual, his face pale and drawn, his hand clutching the stuffed animal Grace had given him during one of their games. A deep sadness washed over Calvin as he realized what he had done. He had taken away the one bright spot in Eli's life. The next morning, the school called to tell Calvin that Eli had spent the entire day in silence, refusing to engage in any activities. He hadn't spoken to his classmates, and his teacher mentioned that he seemed to be pulling further away from everyone. The news rattled Calvin, forcing him to face the painful truth. He couldn't keep pretending that Eli's unhappiness wasn't his responsibility, couldn't ignore how deeply his actions had affected his son. That night, Calvin sat alone in the living room, grappling with his pride. Admitting he was wrong felt impossible, but he knew he had no choice. For Eli's sake, he had to swallow his pride. He needed Grace, and more importantly, Eli needed her. She had brought something into his son's life that Calvin couldn't. A sense of belonging, of being truly seen and loved. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Grace's number, his fingers shaking slightly as he pressed each button. He had her contact info from the employee records. Though he'd never imagined needing it, now he found himself wading through the rings, each one adding to his growing anxiety, until at last, he heard her voice on the other end. "Hello, Grace. It's Calvin Ellis." His voice wavered slightly. He hesitated, unsure how to begin, but knew he had to make things right. I need to talk to you about Eli." There was a pause, and Calvin could almost feel her hesitation, but she didn't hang up. Instead, she responded softly. "What is it, Mr. Ellis?" Calvin took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Grace, I owe you an apology. Eli hasn't been the same since you left. He misses you, and honestly, I see now how wrong I was. I let my own fears get in the way, and I've made a mistake." There was silence on the line, and for a moment, he feared she wouldn't respond. But then he heard her sigh, part surprise, part something else that he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Ellis, I appreciate the apology," she said gently. "But if you're calling about Eli, you need to understand that my presence alone won't fix everything. He needs more than just a temporary connection." Calvin nodded, even though she couldn't see him, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I understand that now," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "But I'm asking, Grace, if you'd consider coming back. Not just for Eli, but because I know he deserves someone like you in his life." Grace's heart ached as she listened to Calvin. She hadn't expected him to call, let alone apologize. His usually controlled, detached voice now trembled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. For a moment, she felt the weight of his regret and the sincerity in his words. But at the same time, she couldn't forget the emotional toll his mistrust had taken on her. Still, thoughts of Eli, his shy smile, the light in his eyes when they shared a moment together, kept tugging at her heart. The idea of him hurting and confused by her absence made her heart ache. "I'll think about it," she replied softly, carefully measured. "But, Mr. Ellis, if I come back, things will need to be different. Eli needs stability, and I can't keep putting myself in a position where every act of kindness is questioned." Calvin paused before responding, his voice firm. "I understand, Grace. Truly. I don't want to make the same mistakes again. I realize now that Eli's well-being has to come before my pride. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." They ended the call with an air of uncertainty lingering between them. Grace knew that returning wouldn't be easy, but the thought of Eli alone in that large, cold house gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to make a decision soon, hoping to give Eli the comfort he so desperately needed. The next day, Grace spent time weighing the decision. She spoke with Owen, explaining that she might be returning to work at the Ellis mansion. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. Owen had always been mature for his age, and it was clear to him that Grace's work with Eli was about more than just a job. But while Grace was deep in thought, Eli's world continued to darken. Confused and heartbroken, he couldn't understand why Grace had left so suddenly. To him it felt like she had abandoned him, and that sense of loss consumed him. He clung to the hope that she might return, but with each passing hour that hope faded further. One afternoon, in a fit of desperation, Eli decided to take matters into his own hands. His father had left for the office early as usual, and the staff were busy with their routines. Eli quietly slipped out of his room unnoticed and headed toward the front door. He wasn't sure where Grace lived, but he remembered overhearing a conversation about a bus she took from the mansion to get home. With determined steps, he made his way down the sidewalk, his small feet moving swiftly. The streets were unfamiliar, full of busy pedestrians and the sounds of traffic, but Eli hardly noticed. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and resolve. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, one of the housekeepers noticed his absence. She checked his room and quickly alerted the other staff, who began searching the grounds in increasing panic. Soon they called Calvin at the office, their voices frantic as they informed him that Eli was missing. Calvin's heart sank. The memory of Grace's words came rushing back, her warnings about Eli needing stability, needing real care. A sickening wave of dread washed over Calvin as he realized just how abandoned his son must have felt. Eli, so desperate and lost, had left on his own, seeking the one person who had made him feel truly loved. Without wasting a second, Calvin rushed out of his office, barely pausing to grab his keys as he sprinted to the car. The drive back to the mansion felt like an eternity, each second stretching out, weighed down by his guilt and growing fear. When he arrived, the staff quickly filled him in on what had happened, explaining that Eli had been seen heading toward the main road, walking with no clear direction. Calvin's heart skipped a beat as he drove down that same route, scanning the sidewalks and intersections, his mind spinning with the worst possible scenarios. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as his heart raced, every part of him praying to spot some sign of his son. He could only hope that Eli hadn't gone too far. But just as he neared a busy intersection, Calvin's eyes caught a small figure standing by the curb. It was Eli, looking lost and terrified, his wide eyes darting nervously as cars whizzed by. Calvin's breath caught in his chest, panic surging through him. He slammed on the brakes, the car still running as he leapt out and sprinted toward Eli. "Eli!" he shouted, his voice desperate. The moment Eli turned and saw his father, his face flooded with relief. But in that moment of distraction, Eli took an unsteady step backward. His foot slipped off the curb just as a car rounded the corner, speeding toward him. Time seemed to slow as Calvin's heart lurched. With every ounce of strength, he lunged forward, his arms outstretched, pulling Eli back just in time as the car screeched to a halt, missing them by inches. Eli clung to his father, his small body shaking with a mix of fear and shock. Calvin wrapped him in his arms, his own heart pounding as the weight of what had nearly happened settled over him. In that moment he understood just how fragile Eli was, just how deeply the loneliness had hurt him. The full gravity of his emotional neglect hit him harder than he'd ever imagined. "Eli," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Eli looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. I wanted to find Grace," he whispered. "I thought if I found her, things would be okay again." Calvin's chest tightened at the desperation in his son's voice. It was a painful reminder of everything he had failed to give Eli, of how badly his son needed him. He hugged Eli tightly, brushing a tear from his cheek as he whispered, "I know, Eli. I know. I'll make it right, I promise." They sat together by the curb for a while, the tension of the near miss slowly melting away. Calvin felt a new resolve building inside him. He would make things right, not just for Eli but for Grace, and for the family he had only just begun to understand he wanted. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Calvin called Grace again. His voice was quieter this time, more raw, more vulnerable. "Grace," he began, the words heavy in his throat. "I need you to come back. Eli needs you. I need you. I've been wrong. I can't change the past, but I want to give Eli the happiness he deserves. And that means doing this together with you." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Grace's voice responded, soft but resolute. "I'll be there tomorrow." For the first time in what felt like a long while, Calvin felt a flicker of hope. There was still so much to fix, so much to make right, but with Grace's return he felt ready to start building the life Eli deserved. One filled with love, care, and stability. The next morning Grace arrived at the Ellis mansion, her emotions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She was glad to be back for Eli, but the sting of Calvin's past accusations still lingered in her heart. She couldn't ignore the wounds his mistrust had left, and part of her feared that coming back might only add more complications. Yet, as she thought about Eli's desperate need for stability, she knew she couldn't stay away. As she stepped through the mansion's grand entrance, the familiar gleam of the marble floors and the soft echo of her footsteps greeted her. But today the atmosphere felt different. One of the staff members smiled warmly at her, nodding in quiet acknowledgement, as though silently thanking her for returning. Grace felt a small comfort at that, knowing that at least to some her presence was welcome. Moments later, Calvin appeared in the hallway. His posture was slightly stiff, but his expression was open, almost contrite. Grace met his gaze, noting the exhaustion and worry etched on his face. He looked different, somehow less guarded. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and she could see the weight of everything that had happened. She braced herself for whatever he had to say. "Grace," he began, his voice softer than usual, as if choosing his words carefully. "Thank you for coming back. I know I've given you every reason not to, and I don't take your decision lightly." She nodded, her expression steady, though she couldn't stop the flutter of emotions rising within her. "I'm here for Eli," she replied simply but firmly. He swallowed, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. "Yes, of course. And I know he needs you more than anything," he said, then paused, taking a deep breath. "But I also owe you an apology." His voice held a sincerity that made Grace's heart ache. "I've been wrong in so many ways. I judged you unfairly, and I questioned your intentions without ever giving you the benefit of the doubt. I thought I was protecting Eli, but I see now that all I was doing was keeping him from what he truly needed." Grace listened in silence, her face unreadable, though her heart softened just slightly. She had longed to hear these words, but deep down, she knew that actions would speak louder than any apology. Calvin took a step closer, his voice almost pleading. "I understand if you're hesitant. I've made it hard for you to trust me, and I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm asking you, Grace, to stay for Eli's sake. He needs the kind of love and care that only you can give him." Grace took a deep breath, her expression softening as she replied, "I'll stay, Mr. Ellis. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about Eli anymore. He's a wonderful child, but he deserves more than the life he's been given. If I'm going to be here, it has to be in an environment where he feels safe and cared for by all of us." Calvin nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "You're right. I want to be there for him too, in ways I haven't been before. I know it will take time, but I want to learn." Just then, Eli appeared at the top of the stairs. His small face lit up when he saw Grace. He let out a joyful gasp and ran down the steps, his arms stretched wide, his eyes filled with relief and happiness. "Grace!" he called, his voice full of pure joy. Grace knelt down, opening her arms just as Eli barreled into her embrace. She felt the warmth of his little arms around her, the tension in his body melting away as he finally felt safe again. "I missed you so much," Eli whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he clung to Grace. His small body was shaking, and his words carried an ache of vulnerability that made her heart twist. "Oh, Eli, I missed you too," she replied, brushing a gentle hand through his hair. "I'm here now. Everything is going to be all right." As the boy relaxed into her embrace, Calvin stood in the doorway, watching the reunion unfold in silence. A profound sense of humility washed over him as he observed the joy radiating from his son. He hadn't realized just how much Grace's presence meant to Eli, how deeply her absence had shaken him. Standing there, witnessing the bond between them, he felt both a deep gratitude and a stirring of something else he couldn't quite name. She had agreed to return. For Eli. For him. And now, he saw that her return had already begun to heal something in their home. As Grace settled back into her duties, the mansion, which had felt like a cold, empty shell for so long, seemed to come alive once more. Eli followed her around, his spirit visibly lighter. His questions and stories poured out of him, and Grace listened intently as he shared everything, from his week at school to the small dreams he'd had, to the games he'd played. Eli grew more animated, his laughter filling the house and replacing the silence that had once hung like a fog. Calvin watched from a distance, his chest tightening with pride, but also with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. It was as if he were seeing his son for the first time in a new light, laughing, opening up, and being truly happy in the presence of someone who wasn't there out of obligation or duty, but because she genuinely cared. It was a reminder of everything he had missed in his relationship with Eli, and it left him feeling a little ashamed. That evening after Eli had gone to bed, Calvin found Grace in the kitchen, tidying up the counters. He cleared his throat, signaling his presence, and she looked up, offering him a polite nod. "I just wanted to thank you again," Calvin began, his voice earnest but quiet. "Not just for coming back, but for everything you've done for Eli." Grace inclined her head, a soft but guarded smile on her lips. "He's a special boy, Mr. Ellis," she replied gently. "I couldn't bear to see him unhappy." Calvin nodded, his gaze dropping momentarily. "I know it's asking a lot, but I'd like to change things. Make this place feel more like a home. Not just for Eli but for everyone here." He hesitated, then continued. "I realize now that my focus on work has cost me more than I ever intended." Grace observed him carefully, noting the honesty in his expression. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of his words. He wasn't just saying it for Eli's sake. There was something deeper, a recognition that he had neglected more than just his son. She could feel it too, the subtle shift in him, the quiet desire to rebuild what had been broken. "Then let's work on that," Grace said gently, her tone warm but practical. "It'll take time, but I believe it's possible." For the first time in a long time, Calvin felt a spark of hope flicker in his chest. He had always believed that providing for Eli financially was enough, that his son would be fine as long as he had everything he needed. But he was beginning to understand, slowly but surely, that love, attention, and connection were things he couldn't buy or delegate. It was a lesson Grace had shown him, even if it had taken him far too long to see it. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion continued to shift. Calvin made a conscious effort to spend more time with Eli, asking about his day, sitting with him during meals, and even joining them for a few moments of play. First it felt awkward. His interactions with Eli had always been more transactional than relational. But with each passing day he found himself looking forward to these moments more and more. Grace, though cautious, could feel the beginnings of a new dynamic forming in the household. It was no longer ruled by isolation and mistrust, but was slowly transforming into a place where love and connection were beginning to take root. And for the first time she dared to hope that they could truly build something together, something lasting and real. The days that followed Grace's return were a whirlwind of quiet, but profound changes. The Ellis mansion, once steeped in cold formality, now felt different, alive. Grace could sense the shift not just in the house but in the people around her, especially in Calvin and Eli. There was a warmth blossoming within the walls, a light that had been absent for far too long. Every morning, Eli would seek Grace out as soon as he woke up, eager to share his thoughts and dreams. His usual shyness seemed to melt away in her presence, replaced by an openness that Grace found endearing. They spent time together after school, reading stories, playing make-believe, laughing. At first, Calvin had watched these interactions from a distance, unsure of his place in this new rhythm. But soon enough he began to join them. One afternoon, after a particularly animated game of hide-and-seek, Calvin found himself caught up in the joy of the moment. He laughed openly with Eli and Grace, a genuine, heartfelt sound that startled him as much as it delighted them. For years his life had been so focused on control, discipline, and order, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. But here with Eli and Grace he felt a warmth, something he hadn't realized he was missing. That evening as they gathered in the family room, Calvin noticed how naturally they had fallen into a new rhythm. Eli sat beside Grace, his head resting on her shoulder as she read aloud from his favorite storybook. Calvin found himself smiling at the sight, a sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't imagined that something as simple as being present could make him feel so complete. But seeing his son content, with Grace by his side, sharing in their lives, filled a void he hadn't even known existed. After Eli went to bed that night, Calvin lingered in the family room. Grace was tidying up, folding blankets, setting pillows back in place. Her movements were gentle, thoughtful, and he watched her for a moment, hesitant to interrupt the quiet calm that filled the room. But he knew he needed to speak. "Grace," he began softly, his voice almost hesitant, "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for coming back, but for everything you've done, for Eli and for me." She turned to him, her expression open, though there was a touch of surprise in her eyes at the sincerity of his tone. "You've thanked me already, Mr. Ellis," she replied gently, a small smile on her lips. "But you're welcome. Eli means a lot to me." Calvin nodded, stepping closer. "He's happier than I've ever seen him," he said, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. "And it's because of you. You've shown me things I couldn't see on my own. Made me realize what I was missing." Grace's smile softened, her eyes meeting his with understanding. She hadn't come back expecting gratitude, but hearing him acknowledge the change in both Eli and himself was more than she had hoped for. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she knew that, for the first time in a long time, there was the possibility of something better, for all of them. Grace felt a warmth rise in her chest at Calvin's words. There was a vulnerability in him now, something she hadn't seen before. A softness that made him seem less like the untouchable businessman she'd first met and more human. "Eli just needed someone to see him," she said quietly, her voice laced with kindness, "and to be there for him." Calvin met her gaze, his eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen before. "I realize now that I should have been that person," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought providing for him financially was enough, but I was wrong." Grace could feel her heart beat a little faster. There was something raw and honest in his words, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from him. "The fact that you're realizing that now, that's what matters," she replied gently. "Eli sees it too. He's noticed how much more you're there for him, and it means the world to him." A silence settled between them, filled with an unspoken understanding. Calvin's gaze softened as he looked at her, and Grace felt a subtle shift in the air, a closeness that felt natural, yet uncharted. Grace realized then how much Calvin had changed since she first met him. How, little by little, he had shed the layers of coldness and distance. There was a warmth in his eyes now, something that made her heart feel unexpectedly full. "Grace," he murmured, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle but heavy with emotion. "I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how much I respect what you've done, not just for Eli but for me as well." Her cheeks warmed, a gentle blush rising as she absorbed his words. She wasn't used to hearing such heartfelt praise, especially not from someone like Calvin. "I'm just doing what I can," she replied softly. "But thank you. It means a lot to hear that from you." They stood there for a moment, their eyes locked, as if each were searching for something in the other. Calvin took a small step closer, his hand lifting slightly, but then falling again, uncertain. He looked as if he wanted to say something more, but before he could, Eli's small voice drifted down the hallway, breaking the spell. "Dad? Grace, can you talk me in?" Grace chuckled softly, and Calvin managed a sheepish smile. "Of course, buddy," he called back, his voice warm with affection. He looked at Grace, his eyes holding a flicker of something unspoken before they both walked down the hall to Eli's room together. After tucking Eli in, Calvin lingered in the doorway, watching Grace as she spoke gently to his son. Her voice was soft and soothing, filling the room with a warmth that made Calvin's chest tighten. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Eli's forehead, her hand lingering there for a moment before she stood, bidding him good night. As they left the room, walking side by side back down the hall, Calvin felt a deep contentment settle over him. He had never realized how much he'd missed these moments, the small everyday gestures that made a house feel like a home. And it was Grace who had brought this warmth, who had opened the door to a life he hadn't known he wanted. That night, after she'd gone home, Calvin sat alone in the family room. His thoughts swirled. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Grace's kindness, her strength, and her unwavering care for Eli had drawn him in, slowly dismantling the walls he'd built around himself. He hadn't thought it was possible, but now, he found himself caring for her in ways that went beyond gratitude. He leaned back, letting out a deep breath as he stared up at the ceiling. The mansion felt different now, alive, with a warmth that was unfamiliar but welcome. And though he couldn't predict what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He wanted Grace to be a part of it. In that quiet moment, Calvin allowed himself to imagine a life where he wasn't alone, where he had Grace and Eli by his side, filling his days with laughter, love, and the sense of belonging he had craved for so long. He realized then that he wasn't just grateful to Grace for her presence in Eli's life. He wanted her in his own life as well. And for the first time he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she felt the same. The next few weeks were a time of transformation within the Ellis household. The tentative bond between Calvin, Grace, and Eli grew stronger each day, as if they were all part of a delicate dance, gradually finding their rhythm together. Grace noticed that Calvin was more involved than ever, making time to join them in their small routines and moments that before he might have overlooked. The mansion, once cold and silent, was now filled with laughter and warmth, as Eli's joy became infectious, seeping into every corner of the house. One Saturday morning, Grace arrived to find Calvin in the kitchen, an apron tied around his waist and a bewildered expression on his face. He stood in front of a countertop covered in flour, eggs, and various kitchen utensils scattered haphazardly. It was clear he'd been attempting to make pancakes, though the outcome was less than successful. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," Grace greeted him, suppressing a smile at the sight. Calvin looked up, his expression equal parts sheepish and determined. "I thought I'd try something new," he admitted, gesturing to the mess with a wry smile. "Eli mentioned he wanted pancakes, and I figured, well, how hard could it be?" Grace chuckled, stepping closer to assess the situation. "It's a nice thought," she replied, glancing at the slightly charred pancake sitting sadly in the pan. "But I think maybe a little guidance wouldn't hurt." At that moment, Eli bounded into the kitchen, his face lighting up as he saw his dad and Grace. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and he looked between them, as if expecting an adventure to unfold. "Are we making pancakes, Dad?" he asked eagerly, his small hands clasped together. Calvin looked at Grace, a little helpless but also determined to make this moment count. "Well, it looks like I could use some help," he said, glancing at the disaster on the stove. Grace smiled at them both, stepping in to lend a hand. The morning was filled with laughter as they all worked together, Grace guiding Calvin through the steps, Eli adding his own touch of joy to the process. It was a simple moment, but it was one that felt real. And for the first time in a long time, Calvin realized that this simple, messy, beautiful life was everything he had been missing. "Grace," Calvin's voice hesitated, a puzzled look crossing his face as he inspected the pancakes that were just slightly more charred than he'd hoped. "Dad's trying to make pancakes, but maybe you could give him a hand?" His eyes met hers, full of hope. "I could really use an expert's help." Grace smiled and nodded, her eyes twinkling. "All right, let's start from the beginning. I'll teach both of you." Under her patient guidance, Calvin and Eli followed her instructions, each step more deliberate than the last. She showed them how to gently whisk the batter, how to measure the flour just right, and how to maintain the perfect temperature on the stove. At first, Calvin fumbled a little, but as they worked together, the awkwardness faded, replaced by laughter. Each new step was less about perfection, and more about enjoying the moment and learning something new together. By the time they finished cooking and sat down to eat, Calvin felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. It was a simple moment, a shared meal with Grace and Eli, but it felt extraordinary. He glanced across the table at Grace, who was laughing at something Eli had done as he smeared syrup on his pancakes, and a warmth bloomed in his chest. After breakfast, they spent the entire day together as a family, something Calvin had never imagined himself doing. They went to the park, played a lively game of soccer in the open field, and ended up feeding the ducks by the pond as the afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light. For the first time in a long while, Calvin wasn't thinking about work or his business troubles. He was fully present, enjoying each moment with the people he cared about, their laughter and easy conversation filling the air. Later that evening, as they returned to the mansion, Grace helped Eli settle in for the night. Calvin stood in the doorway, watching as she gently tucked him into bed and read him one of his favorite stories. Eli's eyelids fluttered, growing heavier, until finally, he drifted off to sleep, his small hand wrapped around Grace's fingers as she whispered a quiet goodnight. Afterward, Grace quietly slipped out of Eli's room, nearly bumping into Calvin, who had been standing just outside. She let out a soft laugh, stepping back. "You startled me," she whispered, glancing up at him with a smile. "Sorry," Calvin said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I didn't mean to. I wanted to thank you again. Grace shook her head, a gentle dismissal. You don't have to keep thanking me, Calvin. I'm just glad I can be here for Eli. The house was quiet. The dim hallway around them felt almost still. Calvin felt an unspoken reluctance to break the silence. His heart thumping in his chest as he took a breath and gathered his courage. Grace, he began, his voice steady, though thick with emotion. I know I've said it before, but you've brought something into our lives I didn't even know we needed. Grace met his gaze, her expression softening as she absorbed his words. Eli's a wonderful child, and you're a good father, she said, her voice sincere. It's been amazing to watch how much he's blossomed with you around. He's lucky to have you. Calvin shook his head, his voice thickening. If I'm a better father, it's because of you, Grace. You showed me what I was missing, what really matters. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. Grace felt a sudden catch in her breath, her heart skipping a beat as his words sank in. There was a raw sincerity in his gaze, something deeper than she'd expected. She hadn't let herself entertain the thought that Calvin might feel more for her, but in that quiet moment, standing together in the hallway, she felt an undeniable connection. Calvin, she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper. I care about you too. About both of you. More than I ever thought I would. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken feelings filling the space between them. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Calvin reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a tentative but unmistakable gesture. Grace didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with his, their hands clasping together in a silent, yet profound acknowledgement. They stood like that for a while, the quiet of the house around them amplifying the words they hadn't yet said. Slowly, Calvin leaned in, his eyes asking a silent question, one that needed no words. Grace's heart raced, a warmth flooding through her as she nodded, a gentle smile curling on her lips. Their lips met softly in a tender kiss. A quiet exchange that held the promise of something new, something hopeful. It was a moment that spoke volumes without a single word. When they finally pulled away, both were smiling, their hands still intertwined. I want this to be real, Calvin said, his voice filled with conviction. Not just for Eli but for us. I want a life with you, Grace. Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes as she nodded. I want that too, Calvin. For all of us. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing their hopes and fears, opening up in ways neither had before. For the first time, Calvin allowed himself to be vulnerable, speaking of the loneliness he'd carried for so long. And Grace, in turn, shared her own struggles, her journey as a single mother and her dreams for Owen's future. As the night wore on, they both felt a deep, unspoken connection, a bond that transcended roles and expectations, forged instead by love and the mutual desire to build something lasting together. By the time they said goodnight and returned to their rooms, hearts full and spirits lifted, they knew their lives had changed forever. No longer were they two people from different worlds. Now they were a family, and the future they were building was filled with hope, laughter, and the kind of love that made everything else fall into place. On a bright morning with sunlight streaming through the mansion's large windows, Calvin called everyone to the living room. There was a spark of excitement in his eyes that Grace and Eli instantly noticed. I've been thinking, he began, his gaze warm and genuine, still new but filled with sincerity. We've been through a lot of changes lately, and I want to do something special to mark this new chapter. Grace tilted her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. What did you have in mind? She asked, her eyes sparkling with interest. Calvin looked first at Eli, then at Grace and Owen, taking a deep breath. I was thinking, why don't we take a family trip? Just the four of us. Somewhere special. Eli's eyes widened in surprise. A family trip? Really? Calvin chuckled, nodding enthusiastically. Yes, really. We deserve a break from our routines. Just some time to enjoy each other's company and relax. Grace felt her heart swell at the idea of spending time away from the mansion. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate everything they had built together. That sounds wonderful, she said warmly. With eager excitement, they began planning their very first family getaway. After much discussion, they settled on a cabin by the lake, an idyllic retreat tucked away in the woods. It was the kind of place where they could escape from the usual demands of life, with no business calls or household chores to worry about, just them. The following weekend they packed up the car and headed toward the cabin, the journey filled with anticipation and laughter. Owen and Eli, now more like brothers than just friends, played games in the back seat, while Grace and Calvin exchanged quiet smiles in the front. When they finally arrived, the boys rushed ahead, their energy boundless. The cabin itself was cozy and charming, exuding a rustic elegance that felt both inviting and peaceful. A large deck overlooked the lake, where the sunlight shimmered across the water, and the surrounding woods seemed to wrap them in nature's embrace. The weekend was spent exploring the lake, hiking through nearby trails, and gathering around a crackling fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. Calvin, who had once been consumed by work and endless responsibilities, found himself truly present in the moment. He reveled in the simple pleasures of being surrounded by the people he loved. One evening after the boys had gone to bed, Calvin and Grace sat together on the deck, wrapped in blankets, gazing up at the stars. The air was cool, and the forest around them filled the silence with its natural sounds. "Thank you for coming back," Calvin said quietly, his gaze steady and full of emotion. "For giving us a chance to be a real family." Grace looked at him, her heart full, and reached for his hand. "Thank you for letting me in, Calvin. I never expected my life to take this turn, but it feels like this is where I'm meant to be." They shared a soft, heartfelt kiss, a silent promise of the future they would build together. For Grace, the journey from being a determined single mother to a woman loved and cherished in a family of her own felt nothing short of miraculous. For Calvin, the transformation from a man driven by ambition to a father and partner filled with warmth and love was something he hadn't believed possible. The next morning they took the boys down to the lake. Eli and Owen splashed in the shallow water, their laughter filling the air as they played together. Grace watched them, a smile spreading across her face as her heart swelled with pride. Calvin stood beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Together they enjoyed the sight of their sons. "They look so happy," he murmured, a deep sense of contentment in his voice. "They are happy," Grace replied, her voice soft and sure. "We all are." As the morning stretched into afternoon, they enjoyed a picnic by the lake. Sandwiches, fruit, and plenty of laughter. Calvin, who would have once seen such a day as a distraction from his work, now savored the simplicity of it. He felt complete, at peace with the life he had once taken for granted. That evening, as they sat around a small fire roasting marshmallows and telling stories, Eli looked up at Grace with a thoughtful expression. "Grace," he asked, his voice full of childlike wonder, Do you think you'll always stay with us?" Grace smiled and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, Eli," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "I plan to be here with all of you for a long, long time." Calvin, who had been sitting beside her, reached over and squeezed her hand. "And soon we'll make that official," he added with a smile. Grace raised an eyebrow, looking at him in surprise. Calvin's gaze softened as he pulled a small box from his pocket. Opening it, he revealed a simple but elegant ring that sparkled in the firelight. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You've brought light and love into my world in a way I never thought possible. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at him, the man who had once been so distant, so closed off, now so open, so vulnerable. He was offering her the kind of love she had always dreamed of but never expected to find. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Calvin, I will." The boys cheered, clapping and laughing as Calvin slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing their future together. They spent the rest of the night under the stars, basking in the joy of a new beginning, their hearts light and full of promise for the future. As the fire dwindled and the night grew quiet, Grace sat beside Calvin, her hand nestled in his. She looked at the faces of her new family, each of them bringing something unique and wonderful into her life. For the first time she felt a peace she had never known before, a deep sense of belonging. This was the family she had always hoped for, the life she had always deserved. And now she knew that together, they would face whatever the future held, bound by love and the resilience they had found in each other. As dawn approached, they drifted off to sleep, knowing this was just the beginning of a beautiful shared journey.